In last week's episode, we talked about whether or not it was possible to say that Undertale was in fact one of the most violent games to come out last year. Let's see what you had to say. Lena R and Julia Athayde, whose last name we just had a long back and forth about the possible pronunciations of, so Julia, if we're getting it wrong, very sorry, talked about something that we sort of grazed on in the episode, but could have spent a little bit more time talking about, which is the degree to which Undertale is also different because your actions in the game don't just contribute to different endings, but also contribute to different presents, to different proceedings, that as you are playing the game, if you are choosing to do a no mercy run, which I learned Toby Fox much prefers no mercy run to genocide run, didn't know that before, so that's good information. The way the characters relate to you changes throughout the game because you are an unforgiving, merciless killer. And this in and of itself is also something that sort of shows how open of a game Undertale is, even though it is by many other measures very restricted. So yeah, this is a great point. Lua263 on the subreddit posted a link to the Grand Theft Auto Pacifist, which I had somehow managed to never see, and is great. You should watch it. No, this should be a period at the end of that. You should watch it. There was a lot of talk on the subreddit, on YouTube, and also on Twitter about the necessary role that available technology plays in this whole conversation about structural violence, because, you know, it's impossible to provide an infinity of options for every player. You can't allow a player to do literally everything. There has to be restrictions of some kind. And ClearandSweet wrote a really great, I think dense, compact, to the point comment on the subreddit about how, you know, there has to be a framework of some kind. You have to have boundaries. And this reminded me of a kind of anecdote or story, just sort of posed question that I saw recently, which was, if you're wondering why there is so much shooting in games and popular gaming, you know, take one look at something like The Last of Us or Fallout 4, and then one look at, you know, social simulators, dating sims, chatbots, and by comparison, the technology of the latter seems like it's stuck in the Stone Age. It's sort of laughable and weird, and that social simulation or things that just aren't combat and spatial simulation are just so much harder to program. So the technology is not nearly as strong. And I think that that is a perfectly fine argument, but I also want to stress that what I find interesting about Undertale is its existence as a counter-argument, in that it shows how much can be accomplished with so little, that we may think of the technology as being not suitable or not strong enough to do those things either convincingly or meaningfully or on the same scale as modeling an entire world and allowing someone to move through it and having it look believable, but that, you know, you can still harness a lot of what's at the heart of what we might want from a believable and good social simulator with, you know, good writing and thinking about how people might orient themselves towards the characters in a game, and that it doesn't necessarily need to rely on the technology, and that the culture of it actually does play a huge role. But yeah, I mean, it's a casserole. 15 Inches, also on the subreddit, points out the distinction between character expression and player expression and how that is very much a part of this question of structural violence in games. And yeah, I absolutely agree. This is something that we covered a little bit, though not in those terms, a while back in an episode about controlling versus being your avatar. And I think that, yeah, these are definitely a pair of ideas that belong next to one another. You know, when you're in a game and the parameters of the game are stopping you from acting, from being in some way your avatar, and are forcing you to just control them within a strict set of available options, then yeah, you're running into that exact problem. So yeah, this is a great comment. And I hope the success of having your comment responded to fills you with even more determination. MyLifeIsAnRPG wrote a really great comment about their experience of Undertale's openness in comparison to more classically considered open games like Fallout 4 or Witcher 3. That sparked a really good and I think really interesting conversation. So I highly recommended reading. It's a great sort of back and forth between a couple of people. We'll put a link to this comment and all of the others in the place where we always do that. SUPPERJOMAN, this is a very good point. I suppose I never really considered the lives or situations of all the various people and beings that are ruined by Katamari. It's actually kind of a dark game it's pretty bleak when you think about it this way. Just swallowing up the universe. Leif, Pipersky, and a bunch of other people took issue with our base level definitions of AAA games and violence. And I think that that's warranted. We moved pretty quickly through those things, and they are important base level ideas for the premise of the episode. But I do think at a sort of fundamental level, AAA tends to be a kind of tautological label because like Leif says, you say that it's not about a game's look or feel, it is about its development budget and the size of its marketing campaign. But the fact of the matter happens to be that games which get that AAA marketing campaign and development budget all tend, not to a game, but for the most part tend to look and play similarly to one another. So it doesn't really free us from the tautology, really. My suspicion is that AAA as a designation has a lot of the same problems as the designation blockbuster for movies. That there was a point in like the 70s where blockbuster really meant something. It was a movie that was grossing really highly, had a strong cultural impact, was breaking records. But now I think, especially with the admission that there is such a thing as blockbuster season, a blockbuster movie is, I think, a movie that would tend to attempt to do that kind of thing, though it might not actually be successful at it. And I think that there are movies that can be successful at what a blockbuster movie would do that we would not call blockbusters. Like if, for whatever reason, an art film came out and was the highest grossing film for 2 weeks, I think most people would not naturally tend to call that a blockbuster. And so I think that it's another kind of tautology where it's like, like, oh, what's a blockbuster? It's a movie that busts blocks. And as far as our definition of violence is concerned, I really do think that there are all kinds of grounded ideas that support a concept of violence sort of centered in varying degrees and types of removal of choice. We talked about it a little bit in the DDoS episode from a while back. It's grounded in dramatic theory, which I think is appropriate for all kinds of reasons, specifically Anne Bogart, who was great. And I think that this sense of violence does unite all of the ways that people use and think about the idea of violence, though perhaps in strange and unexpected ways, which, I'm realizing because when we use this definition, we tend to get pushed back on it. So I don't know, maybe there is like a whole video in here to just talk about how and why we've sort of arrived at this as our working definition for violence. I don't know, is that something you would be interested in? Would you watch that? Daniel Masterson goes a little bit deeper into the effective nature of violence in media, and I think sort of hits on this thing where even in its absence, it becomes something that we think about and discuss, as is the case with Undertale, that even when it's not there and you're not forced to engage in it in a narrative way, you're still viewing the situation through the specter of violence. And I think that this is just such a strong idea, especially as it relates to games and this sense that it's a reflex. It's what we are expecting to come to when we come to games. That gaming in and of itself has over it or sits within this shadow of violence, which I think is a really interesting and important lens to look through, hat to put on, metaphor for using. And finally, Anony Mole gets to the really important and I think impactful economic aspect of this whole conversation, which is games are made this way because it's what people have come to expect. It's what they will spend money on. It's what everybody knows they will enjoy. And to a certain degree, that also dictates how the tools that make games communicate what kinds of games can and should be made. And so you just have this big Ouroboros. It's just this constant self-feeding, self-fulfilling prophecy. But I think it's also important to remember that this is all sits on a kind of cultural layer that's not given, and that we can question and we can show with games like Undertale how important and powerful it is when it is questioned. It would be great if there were easier and more reliable ways for things that challenge this status quo to get made and to get put in front of the public eye. Of course, Kickstarter was a huge part of Undertale's success and hopefully will be, you know, a part of this conversation for a while. But yeah, it would be amazing if there was something that was more impactful. I think what I'm trying to say is that there should be a taxpayer-funded grant for out-of-the-ordinary indie games. I think that's the only solution to this problem.